If you had any brains, I would not have to apologize for your existence to our neighbors, my father spat, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of our $4.2 million Greenwich mansion like a physical blow. I am Riley Vance, and I am 27 years old. To the professional world of Silicon Valley, I am a high-level data architect capable of mapping complex information structures that baffle the average mind. But to the people who raised me in the suffocating luxury of Fairfield County, I am simply the girl who could not read. I have severe dyslexia, a neurological wiring that makes traditional literacy feel like trying to decipher a reflection in a shattered mirror. While my older sister Madison, who is now 30, was collecting Ivy League degrees and accolades like charms on a Tiffany bracelet, I was being told, quite literally and frequently, that I was a genetic malfunction. My father, Harrison Vance, a man whose entire identity is built on the sharp crease of his Brioni suits and the prestige of his private equity firm, looked at me that evening with a disgust so potent it felt like a cold draft in the room. We were standing in the grand foyer, a space dominated by a 3,000-pound slab of Italian Calicotta marble and a custom-made crystal chandelier that cost more than most people's college tuitions. The air in the house always smelled of expensive sandalwood candles and a lingering, sterile scent of lemon wax, a scent that now makes my stomach turn with instinctive anxiety. It was the night of the annual North Street Block Association Gala, an event where the wealthiest families in Greenwich gather to subtly one-up each other's charitable donations and child success stories. I was 22 then, a recent graduate from a specialized program they had barely acknowledged, and I had committed the ultimate sin of stumbling over the name of our neighbor's new architectural firm during small talk. To my father, that momentary lapse, that brief struggle for my brain to align the phonetics of a word with the image of the person standing before me, was a stain on the Vance legacy. He did not see the 3 screens on my desk at home filled with elegant, shimmering lines of code that I could read as easily as breathing. He only saw a daughter who made him look unpolished in front of a man who owned a minority stake in a professional football team. My mother, Eleanor, stood just behind him, her hand instinctively adjusting the clasp of her vintage 1960s Cartier necklace. She did not defend me. She never did. She merely sighed, a soft, practiced sound of disappointment that was somehow more exhausting than my father's rage. She looked at me, taking in my appearance from my neatly tailored charcoal blazer to the way I was nervously gripping the strap of my leather laptop bag. To her, I was a project that had failed to launch, a beautiful house with a foundation she considered cracked beyond repair. Now, let me take you back to the cold, damp November morning when the true depth of their resentment finally crystallized into a moment that would change the trajectory of my life forever. I remember the exact weight of the air that morning. It was overcast, the kind of New England gray that makes the stone walls of Greenwich look like prison boundaries. I was sitting at the massive mahogany breakfast table, the surface polished to such a high sheen that I could see my own reflection staring back at me, looking small and uncertain. Before me sat a bowl of steel-cut oatmeal and a glass of freshly pressed green juice that cost $16 at the local organic market. My father was scrolling through the Wall Street Journal on his iPad Pro, the rhythmic tap of his finger against the glass sounding like a ticking clock. Madison was home for the weekend from her junior year at Yale, sitting across from me in a pristine white cashmere sweater, her skin glowing with the effortless confidence of someone who had never had to fight for a single grade. "Riley," my mother said, her voice dropping into that tone she used when she was about to deliver a directive masqueraded as a suggestion. "We were looking over the guest list for the winter benefit. We think it might be best if you stayed upstairs this year, or perhaps you could visit your aunt in Scottsdale for the week. It is just that with Madison bringing her new beau, the son of the Wentworths, the conversation is going to be quite academically rigorous. We would hate for you to feel overwhelmed or for things to get complicated." The word complicated was their code for my presence. They feared I would say something wrong, read a name tag incorrectly, or simply exist as a reminder that their perfect pedigree had produced something they deemed flawed. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, a mixture of shame and a burgeoning, jagged spark of defiance. I looked at my sister, hoping for a shred of solidarity, but Madison didn't even look up from her phone. She was busy responding to an email from a prestigious law firm where she had secured a summer internship that paid more than my entire year's worth of freelance coding work at the time. "I am not going to Scottsdale, Mom," I said, my voice thin but steady. "I have work to do. I have a contract with a startup in Austin that I need to finish by Friday." My father finally looked up, his eyes cold and dismissive behind his designer tortoiseshell glasses. "A contract? You mean that little hobby of yours? Let's be realistic, Riley. You're playing with blocks on a screen because you can't handle a real career. You should be grateful we've kept you on the payroll this long. You're 22. Most people with your limitations are lucky to find a desk job at a library where they don't have to talk to anyone." The cruelty of his words wasn't just in the content, but in the casual delivery. He said it with the same indifference he used to check the morning's stock tickers. To him, my struggles with dyslexia were a personal affront, a sign of laziness or a lack of character rather than a different way of processing the world. He ignored the fact that I had spent 16 hours a day teaching myself Python and C++ because the visual logic of programming languages made sense to me in a way that the English alphabet never would. He didn't care that I was already earning 6 figures under a pseudonym because the tech world only cared about my output, not my ability to read a dinner menu aloud. I stood up, my chair screeching against the heated limestone floors. The sound was jarring in the quiet, perfectly curated room. I didn't say another word. I walked out of that kitchen, through the gallery lined with original oil paintings by artists whose names I could recognize by their brushstrokes, even if I couldn't always spell them, and up the grand staircase. Every step felt like I was shedding a layer of the person they wanted me to be. I went into my bedroom, a space that felt more like a high-tech bunker than a young woman's sanctuary. I locked the door and sat down at my workstation, the glow of 4 32-inch 4K monitors washing over me in a comforting blue light. I looked at the lines of code, the beautiful, cascading logic of a database I was building for a global logistics firm. Here, I wasn't the girl who couldn't read. I was the architect of an entire digital universe. I could see the flow of information like a river, predicting bottlenecks and creating pathways with a speed that my peers found terrifying. I reached for my phone, a 2024 midnight black iPhone 15 Pro, and saw a notification from my bank. A direct deposit of $45,000 had just cleared, the final milestone payment for a project I had completed for a fintech giant in London. My parents thought I was living on an allowance they grumbled about providing. In reality, I had more liquid assets than Madison's trust fund would see in a decade. But the money didn't stop the ache. It didn't erase the memory of my father's hand dismissing my entire existence with a wave. It didn't soothe the sting of my mother wanting to hide me like a piece of tarnished silver when the important guests arrived. I realized then that I was living in a house of ghosts, surrounded by people who loved a version of me that didn't exist and hated the version that did. I spent the next 4 hours packing a single Toomey hardshell suitcase. I didn't take the designer dresses they bought me to make me look the part of a Vance daughter. I didn't take the jewelry. I took my hardware, my custom-built mechanical keyboard with its tactile clicks that grounded me, my high-end noise-canceling headphones, and the few books I had managed to master through sheer, agonizing willpower. As I walked down the stairs 3 hours later, the house was quiet. My parents had gone to the country club for lunch, and Madison was likely at the gym or meeting friends at an upscale bistro on Greenwich Avenue. I stood in the foyer one last time, looking at the marble and the crystal and the perfectly manicured lawn visible through the sidelights of the mahogany front door. This place was a fortress of superficiality, and I was finally climbing over the walls. I pulled out my phone and summoned a black car. 10 minutes later, a 2024 Cadillac Escalade pulled into the circular driveway. The driver, a man who didn't know my name or my history, hopped out to take my bag. "Where to, miss?" he asked. JFK, I said, my voice sounding different even to my own ears. Terminal 4. I was going to Austin. I had a lease signed on a sleek industrial loft in the South Congress District, a place with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a city that valued innovation over pedigree. I had a job waiting for me as a lead data architect at a firm that didn't know I was a Vance and didn't care that I had a learning disability. They only knew that I was the best they had ever seen. As the Escalade pulled away from the mansion, I watched the massive wrought-iron gates close in the rearview mirror. I felt a strange, hollow sense of relief. I was leaving the $4.2 million prison, but I was carrying the bruises with me. Family is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to translate yourself. It is supposed to be the soil where you are allowed to grow, regardless of whether you bloom in the way they expected. But for some of us, family is the first hurdle we have to clear. My father's words about my lack of brains would stay with me, a bitter fuel that I would use to power my climb. But as the car hit the Merritt Parkway, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer apologizing for my existence. I was finally starting to live it. The contrast between my life and the carefully curated image of the Vance legacy was not just noticeable, it was sickening. A visceral manifestation of the hierarchy my father had established before I was even old enough to read. My father, Harrison Vance, stood at the helm of Vance Global Logistics, a $90 million empire that had been meticulously built from the ground up by my grandmother, Evelyn Vance, a woman whose grit and business acumen were legendary, but whose warmth had skipped a generation when it came to her son. The company headquarters was a glass and steel monolith in the heart of the financial district, a building that seemed to vibrate with the hum of global commerce and the quiet, lethal efficiency of high-stakes logistics. In that world, my sister Madison was the undisputed golden child, a woman who moved through the executive suites with the practiced grace of a queen regent already wearing the crown. At 30 years old, she had been fast-tracked to the position of Chief Operating Officer, a role accompanied by a staggering $320,000 base salary and a company-paid 2024 frozen blue metallic Porsche Taycan that sat in a reserved spot near the building's entrance like a shimmering trophy. I, on the other hand, was the shadow in the corner of the family portrait, hired into the company as a junior clerk, not because of my aptitude for data or my tireless work ethic, but out of what my father frequently described as pity. My salary was a meager $44,500 a year, a sum that in New York City felt less like a wage and more like a cruel joke designed to keep me perpetually tethered to the bottom rung of the ladder. While Madison was sipping artisanal espresso in meetings with international shipping magnates, I was navigating the reality of a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a weathered brick building in Astoria, Queens. I shared that cramped, suffocating space with two roommates, one a struggling actress and the other a night shift nurse, meaning there was never a moment of true silence or a square inch of the linoleum floor that wasn't cluttered with someone else's life. My commute was a daily penance performed in a 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic with a deep, rusted dent in the rear passenger fender from a hit-and-run I couldn't afford to fix, its engine idling with a rough, rhythmic shudder that felt like a reflection of my own nerves. The physical reality of my professional life was perhaps the most pointed insult of all, as my designated office was not a room with a view or even a cubicle with an ergonomic chair, but a windowless supply closet located dangerously close to the heavy, clanging doors of the freight elevator. This 4-by-8-foot space smelled of industrial floor wax, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of old filing cabinets, lit by a single flickering fluorescent bulb that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. This was where I spent 10 hours a day, tucked away from the eyes of the prestigious clients and the polished staff, hunched over a dated flatbed scanner as I processed endless stacks of crumpled freight invoices. My father had claimed this role would teach me the value of the business from the ground up, but we both knew the truth was that he wanted me where I couldn't be heard, where my struggles with words wouldn't embarrass him, and where my presence wouldn't remind anyone that the Vance bloodline was capable of anything less than perfection. The air in that closet was always thick and stagnant, vibrating every time the freight elevator groaned to life to move massive crates of electronics or luxury textiles from the loading dock. I would sit on a hard plastic stool that lacked back support, my fingers moving with a mechanical precision as I fed sheet after sheet of paper into the machine, watching the digital images bloom on my monitor. But what my father and Madison didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly fathom as they looked down at me from their heights of silk and steel, was that I was doing more than just scanning. While my eyes struggled to make sense of the tangled letters of the vendor names, my mind was effortlessly absorbing the data behind them. I saw the patterns in the shipping routes, the fluctuations in fuel surcharges, and the glaring inefficiencies in the middle-mile logistics that were costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost time and redundant labor. To them, I was a girl failing to read a simple invoice. To me, I was a data architect watching a chaotic system reveal its hidden architecture through the numbers they were too busy to analyze. I remember one Tuesday afternoon particularly vividly, a day when the humidity in the city had turned the air into a wet wool blanket and the cooling system in the supply closet had finally given out. I was sweating through my polyester blend blouse, my hair sticking to the back of my neck as I worked through a backlog of international bills of lading from our Singapore terminal. Madison had glided past the service hallway earlier that morning, looking cool and untouchable in a $2,000 ivory wool suit, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic staccato on the polished concrete that sounded like a countdown. She had peeked into my closet for a brief second, not to offer help or a kind word, but to remind me that the quarterly audit was approaching and that I shouldn't dare to leave a single page unscanned, her voice dripping with the condescending sweetness of a master speaking to a servant. She didn't see the laptop I had hidden beneath a pile of manila folders, a high-performance machine I had purchased with the secret freelance earnings they knew nothing about, which was currently running a custom script I had written to categorize and optimize every piece of data I touched. Every invoice I scanned was a brick in a fortress I was building in the dark, a silent rebellion against the narrative they had written for me since the day my third-grade teacher told them I might never be able to keep up with the other children. My father's $90 million empire was a giant with feet of clay, built on the legacy of a woman who was long gone and managed by a man who valued perception over substance. And as I sat in that windowless room, I began to realize that I held the keys to the kingdom in my very hands. The $44,500 they paid me was meant to keep me small, to keep me dependent on their occasional acts of charity and the meager crumbs of validation they threw my way during holiday dinners. But instead, it became the price they paid for my access to their most intimate secrets. I watched the flow of money, the hidden debts, the contracts that were nearing expiration, and the way the company's internal logic was beginning to fray under my father's rigid, outdated management style. Living in that Queen's studio was an exercise in sensory overload that stood in stark contrast to the hollow silence of the Greenwich mansion, the sounds of the N and W trains rattling the window frames and the smell of the street-level halal cart wafting up the fire escape. My roommates, Sarah and Jessica, were kind enough, but they existed in a world of immediate needs and fleeting dreams, unable to understand why I would spend my few hours of freedom staring at lines of glowing code or mapping out the logistical networks of a company that treated me like trash. They saw the dented Honda and the tired lines around my eyes and assumed I was just another casualty of the city's grinding gears, never suspecting that the girl in the cramped kitchen eating $3 ramen was actually a silent partner in the very industry that moved the world around them. My father's pride was a brittle thing, a thin veneer of success that required my constant failure to remain intact, and he took every opportunity to reinforce the distance between my reality and Madison's. At a mandatory family brunch that month, held at an over-the-top French bistro where the mimosas cost $24 a glass, he had spent 20 minutes praising Madison's initiative in securing a new warehouse lease in New Jersey, while I sat quietly, picking at a plate of cold eggs I couldn't really afford. When he finally looked at me, It was only to ask if I had finished the filing for the June transatlantic shipments, his tone implying that even that basic task might be beyond my capabilities. I had simply nodded, my heart thudding against my ribs, knowing that the filing he spoke of was actually a comprehensive digital map I had created that highlighted a 2% leak in their revenue stream, a leak caused by his own hand-picked shipping partners. The injustice of it all was a constant low-grade fever, a heat that burned in the back of my throat every time I saw the frozen blue Porsche in the parking garage or heard the way the office staff whispered when Madison walked by. They didn't see the genetic malfunction they claimed I was. They saw a powerhouse, while I was the invisible girl in the closet who couldn't even get the freight elevator operator to remember my name. But as the weeks turned into months, my internal landscape began to shift, the shame and the hurt crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve that was as unbreakable as the encryption on my private servers. I was the architect of my own survival, learning the language of power through the very documents they used to demean me. And I knew that the windowless supply closet was not my final destination, but my training ground. Family is often defined by the titles we are given at birth, the roles we are expected to play to maintain the equilibrium of a parent's ego, but I was beginning to understand that those titles are as temporary as the ink on a freight invoice. My father and sister had mistaken my silence for stupidity and my dyslexia for a lack of vision, never realizing that while they were looking at the words on the page, I was looking at the spaces between them where the truth actually lived. The contrast between the $320,000 COO and the $44,500 clerk was a chasm they thought I could never cross, but they had forgotten one fundamental rule of logistics. It is not the size of the vessel that matters most, but the precision of the path it takes through the storm. I was navigating my own path now, fueled by the memory of every insult and every dismissive glance, waiting for the moment when the data I had meticulously gathered would finally speak for itself and shatter the glass and steel illusion they called a life. The point of no return did not happen in the sterile quiet of our Greenwich home or the cramped confines of my windowless supply closet at the office, but rather in the suffocatingly opulent grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel during Madison's partner celebration. It was an evening designed to be a coronation, a public declaration of the Vance dynasty's continuity, attended by over 400 guests who represented the absolute zenith of the city's political and financial elite. The air inside the ballroom was a thick, cloying mixture of expensive floral arrangements, predominantly white hydrangeas and rare orchids, and the sharp, metallic scent of high-end perfume that seemed to coat the back of my throat. Gold leaf molding caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers, casting a shimmering, almost holy glow over a sea of men in custom-tailored tuxedos and women draped in shimmering couture that cost more than my entire annual salary. I felt like a glitch in a high-definition photograph, sitting at table 42, a position so poorly situated it was practically an insult, tucked behind a massive, cold marble pillar near the swinging double doors of the kitchen. From my vantage point, I could smell the scorched butter and hear the frantic clatter of the catering staff, a constant reminder that I was closer in status to the servers than to the people sharing my last name. I was wearing a $60 charcoal-colored wrap dress from Zara that I had painstakingly steamed in my cramped queen's bathroom that morning, a garment that felt like a cheap costume compared to the $3,000 Valentino gown Madison wore as she held court at the head table. My sister looked radiant, her hair styled in effortless waves and her neck adorned with our grandmother Evelyn's vintage diamond choker, a piece of jewelry that had been promised to me in a different life before my father decided I wasn't worthy of the family's sparkling history. As the third course of poached lobster was being cleared, my father, Harrison Vance, stood up and smoothed the front of his midnight blue dinner jacket before stepping onto the stage with the practiced confidence of a man who owned every room he entered. He reached for the microphone, and the room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system and the distant honking of yellow cabs on Central Park South. He spoke of legacy, of the $90 million empire that Vance Global Logistics had become, and of the brilliance required to navigate the treacherous waters of modern global commerce. The climax of his speech arrived when he announced, with a voice booming with pride, that Madison would be inheriting 100% of his estate, a declaration that included the 12-acre beachfront compound in the Hamptons and the inevitable transition into the CEO chair upon his retirement. The room erupted in a polite, synchronized wave of applause, a sound that felt like thunder inside my chest as I watched my sister beam under the spotlight. And then the applause died down, and my father's gaze shifted, cutting through the crowd until it found me, partially obscured by the pillar at the back of the room. He chuckled into the microphone, a sound that was light and jovial on the surface, but held the cutting edge of a jagged blade. "And to Riley," he said, his voice dripping with a condescending playfulness that made my skin crawl, "we have made very specific arrangements to ensure she is cared for in a way that suits her unique abilities. We have set up a modest trust to ensure she is never a burden on the state, because let's be honest, some people are born to lead, and others are simply born to follow instructions." The room erupted again, but this time it was a different kind of sound, a ripple of polite, condescending laughter that felt like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at my dignity. I felt the sweat begin to prickle under the cheap fabric of my Zara dress, my face flushing a deep, hot crimson as the strangers at my table turned to look at me with expressions ranging from pity to outright amusement. My father hadn't just disinherited me. He had infantilized me in front of the very people I had spent my entire adult life trying to impress, turning my neurological struggle into a punchline for the entertainment of the 1%. He stood there on that stage, silhouetted by the gold and crystal of the plaza, looking down at me as if I were a defective piece of equipment that had finally been decommissioned. I looked at Madison, expecting to see a flicker of sisterly guilt or a momentary lapse in her poise, but she was simply nodding in agreement, her hand resting on her Porsche key fob as if she had already mentally moved into the Hamptons estate. At that moment, the heat in my face began to cool into something much more dangerous. A cold, crystalline clarity that silenced the roar of the crowd in my ears. The shame that had been my constant companion since the 3rd grade evaporated, replaced by a realization that was as sharp and undeniable as the data sets I spent my nights constructing. My father believed that my inability to read a teleprompter or a balance sheet in the way he did meant that I was incapable of power, but he had failed to realize that by pushing me into the shadows, he had given me the perfect vantage point to map the cracks in his foundation. He thought he was tossing me a lifeline with a modest trust, a calculated move to keep me quiet and compliant, but all he had done was sever the final thread of loyalty that held me to the Vance name. I reached into my small, unbranded clutch and felt the cool, brushed aluminum of my secondary phone, the one that held the encryption keys to the server I had spent the last 8 months building in my windowless supply closet. The laughter of the 400 guests continued to echo off the vaulted ceilings, a symphony of arrogance that I knew would be their swan song. I looked at the man on the stage, the father who had spent 27 years apologizing for my existence, and I realized that he was the one who was actually blind. He was looking at a daughter who couldn't read a speech, while I was looking at a CEO who had left his entire back-end infrastructure vulnerable to the very girl he had assigned to scan his trash. He saw a follower of instructions, never imagining that I had spent my time at Vance Global Logistics rewriting the instructions themselves, creating a digital architecture that would eventually make his outdated methods obsolete. I didn't run out of the room in tears, nor did I stand up and make a scene that would only confirm their biases. Instead, I sat perfectly still, my spine pressed against the hard back of the banquet chair, and I smiled a small, private smile that no one in that room was smart enough to fear. The celebration continued with expensive champagne and a 5-tier cake, but I was already miles away, mentally navigating the lines of code that would begin the process of uncoupling my life from theirs. I thought about my 400-square-foot studio in Queens and my dented 2012 Honda Civic, and for the first time, they didn't feel like marks of failure, but like the humble beginnings of a legend they wouldn't see coming until it was too late to stop. Family is often sold to us as a bond that is unbreakable, a blood oath that requires us to endure any amount of cruelty in exchange for the comfort of belonging. But as I sat at table 42, I realized that true family is the people who see your worth even when you are standing in the dark. My father had spent the evening defining my value by what I couldn't do, but I was about to define my future by what I could do better than anyone else in that ballroom. When the gala finally ended and the elite began to filter out onto the red carpet of Fifth Avenue, I walked out alone, my heels clicking on the marble floors with a newfound weight and purpose. I didn't wait for my parents to say goodbye, and I didn't congratulate Madison on her victory. I simply walked through the revolving doors and into the cool, damp night air of New York City. The city was alive with the sound of sirens and the hum of a million different stories. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how mine was going to end. As I hailed a yellow cab to take me back to Queens, I looked back at the glowing windows of the plaza and felt a profound sense of peace. The modest trust my father had mentioned would never be touched, and the follow instructions role he had assigned me was officially vacant. I was Riley Vance. I was 27 years old, and I was no longer a burden on the state or a malfunction in a legacy. I was the architect of the storm that was about to break over the Vance empire, and by the time the sun rose, the first lines of code would already be in motion to ensure that the girl who couldn't read would be the only one who truly knew the story. The weight of the night felt different as the cab wove through the late-night traffic of Midtown, the neon lights of Times Square blurring into a streak of colors that I didn't need to name to understand. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark interior of the taxi with a soft, steady glow that felt more like home than any mansion ever had. My fingers hovered over the keys, the tactile feedback a familiar comfort that grounded me in a world that made sense. I wasn't just Riley Vance, the girl behind the pillar. I was the silent witness to every financial bypass, every corner cut, and every ego-driven mistake my father and sister had made in their pursuit of the $90 million crown. They had spent the night celebrating a future that was already slipping through their fingers, built on the assumption that I was a follower who didn't understand the game. But as the cab crossed the Queensboro Bridge, I began the final sequence of the audit I had been running in secret, a program designed to expose the 2% revenue leak I had discovered weeks ago. A leak that, once publicized, would call into question the very leadership my father had just praised. The story of the Vance family was about to change, and for once, I was the one holding the pen. I sat in the driver's seat of my dented 2012 taffeta white Honda Civic at 1:24 a.m., the car idling with that familiar rhythmic shudder that felt like a failing heartbeat against the asphalt of a 7-Eleven parking lot on the outskirts of Queens. The world outside was a desolate landscape of flickering amber streetlights and the occasional hum of a passing delivery truck, while inside, the only illumination came from the harsh, clinical blue light of the convenience store sign reflecting off my windshield. I was eating a cold, congealed slice of pepperoni pizza that tasted more like cardboard and salt than actual food, but I barely registered the flavor as I stared at the passenger seat. There, resting on the worn fabric, was a small, locked mahogany box that had been handed to me by my grandmother, Evelyn Vance, just 3 days before she passed away in her hospice suite at Greenwich Hospital. She had been the only person in the entire Vance bloodline who looked at my struggle with the written word and saw something other than a deficit. The only one who realized that my severe dyslexia was not a disability, but a specialized neurological gift for extreme pattern recognition. She used to tell me that while others were trapped in the trees of the alphabet, I was the only one who could see the entire forest of the data. And that night, under the buzzing fluorescent lights of a gas station, I finally understood why she had been so protective of this specific heirloom. I did not cry, because tears felt like a luxury I could no longer afford after the humiliation at the Plaza Hotel. Instead, I felt a cold, surgical precision take hold of my nervous system as I reached for the box. The mahogany was cool and smooth, smelling faintly of cedar and the expensive Chanel No. 5 perfume that Evelyn had worn every day of her life, even when she was too weak to stand. I used a small, delicate brass key that I had kept hidden inside the lining of my laptop bag for years, inserting it into the lock and feeling the satisfying, heavy click of the mechanism releasing. When the lid swung open, I didn't find jewelry or sentimental photographs or the yellowed letters of a bygone era. Inside the velvet-lined interior sat a thick, professional-grade legal envelope embossed with the seal of a law firm that had been defunct for 20 years, and tucked beside it was a sleek, industrial-grade silver USB drive. The weight of the envelope felt like lead in my hands as I pulled out a series of notarized documents, my eyes scanning the pages with that rapid, non-linear processing speed that allowed me to bypass the words and go straight to the structural logic of the signatures and dates. As I began to digest the contents of those papers, the reality of my life began to shift, the foundation of the Vance global logistics empire crumbling and reforming into a much uglier shape right before my eyes. I realized then, with a clarity that felt like a physical shock to my chest, that my father, Harrison Vance, had not built this $90 million company through the visionary leadership he boasted about at every gala. He had effectively hijacked it through a series of fraudulent transfers and forged signatures during my grandmother's first bout with illness in the early 2000s. The documents were a trail of breadcrumbs Evelyn had left behind, a detailed ledger of how Harrison had manipulated the board of directors and siphoned off shares that were legally intended to be held in a blind trust for his children, specifically ensuring that he had total control while stripping the original charter of its protections. Love, or at least the illusion of the familial bond I had been trying to salvage for 27 years, was officially dead, replaced by the cold, hard realization that my father saw his daughters not as successors, but as assets to be managed or liabilities to be liquidated. The USB drive was even more damning, containing encrypted backups of the original accounting software from 2004, the year the company supposedly made its first major leap in valuation. As I plugged the drive into my laptop, the screen illuminating the dark interior of the Honda with a ghostly glow, I saw the truth of the Vance legacy. It was built on a lie of exponential growth that covered up a massive embezzlement scheme my father used to fund his lavish Greenwich lifestyle. My father had spent years calling me a genetic malfunction and telling the world I was a burden on the state, while he was the one who was a parasite on the very company my grandmother had bled for. I sat there in the silence of the parking lot, the heater in my car blowing a faint, dusty warmth against my ankles, and I felt the last remnants of my hesitation evaporate into the night air. It was no longer about proving my worth or seeking a seat at their table. It was time for a hostile takeover, a systematic dismantling of the man who had tried to bury me in a windowless supply closet. I watched a lone figure walk out of the 7-Eleven with a steaming cup of coffee, their silhouette momentarily blocking the light, and I realized that I was the only person in the world who knew that the $90 million Vance empire was currently sitting on a fault line of its own making. My grandmother had known that my brain was wired to find the anomalies, to see the one missing digit in a sea of millions, and she had entrusted me with the ultimate anomaly, the crime that birthed our fortune. I began to type, my fingers moving across the mechanical keyboard with a speed that felt like a symphony, creating an encrypted cloud partition where I could begin cross-referencing these old documents with the live shipping data I had been scanning at the office for $44,000 a year. The contrast was staggering. My father was currently at the Greenwich mansion, probably sipping a 20-year-old scotch and celebrating Madison's future, unaware that his junior clerk was currently mapping out the exact sequence of digital strikes that would bring his world crashing down. The 2012 Honda Civic felt like a command center, a small, dented fortress of truth in a world of polished lies, and as the clock on the dashboard ticked toward 2 a.m., I felt a sense of power that was deeper and more permanent than anything my father had ever felt. He had given Madison a Porsche Taycan and a CEO title, but he had inadvertently given me the keys to his destruction by assuming I was too broken to look closely at the paperwork. I thought about the way he chuckled into the microphone at the plaza, the way the elite guests had laughed at my expense, and I realized that their laughter was the sound of a dying era. My pattern recognition wasn't just a gift for data architecture. It was a weapon of war, allowing me to see the exact moment when the Vance Global Logistics stock would become vulnerable to a forced liquidation if the fraud was brought to light in a specific, high-pressure environment. I wasn't going to the police, and I wasn't going to a lawyer yet. I was going to use the very tools of high finance and logistics that my father worshipped to strip him of everything he had stolen. Family is often the place where we are most vulnerable, because we expect the people who share our DNA to be our protectors. But for the Vances, DNA was just another data point to be manipulated for profit. My father had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small so that I wouldn't notice how small he actually was. But the mahogany box had changed the scale of the game forever. I looked at the congealed pizza slice, then tossed it back into the grease-stained box, feeling a sudden, sharp hunger for something that food couldn't satisfy. I put the Honda into gear, the engine whining as I pulled out of the 7-Eleven lot and began the drive back to my cramped studio in Queens. But I didn't feel like a clerk returning to a shared apartment. I felt like a ghost who had finally found the door back into the living world, and I was carrying a storm in my passenger seat that would wash away the Greenwich Mansion and the 12-acre Hamptons estate before the year was out. The highway was empty, a long ribbon of black asphalt that mirrored the path I was now taking, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to translate my thoughts into a language my parents would understand. I was operating in the language of numbers, of logic, and of cold, hard evidence, a language where I was the undisputed master and where my father was a common thief. As I passed the sign for the Queensboro Bridge, the city skyline rose up to meet me, a shimmering grid of lights that I could read better than any book I had ever been forced to struggle through in school. I knew exactly which servers to access, which offshore accounts to track, and which board members had the weakest stomachs for a scandal. This was the hostile takeover of Harrison Vance's soul, and by the time I was finished, the only thing left of the Vance legacy would be the truth that a girl with a disability was the only one who actually knew how to run the business. I parked the car on my street in Astoria, the neighborhood quiet except for the distant sound of a siren, and I sat there for a moment longer, holding the USB drive in my hand like a talisman. My roommates were asleep, the radiator would be clanking, and tomorrow I would have to go back to that windowless closet and scan more invoices for a man who hated me. But everything had changed. Every document I touched from now on would be a piece of a larger puzzle I was solving, a puzzle that ended with my father standing exactly where he had put me, at the very bottom, with nowhere to go and no one to blame but himself. I realized then that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who has been underestimated for 27 years, and as I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I didn't feel tired at all. I felt like the architect of a new reality, one where the girl who couldn't read was the only one who could see the end of the story coming. And for the first time since I was a child, I slept without the weight of my father's disappointment pressing down on my chest. The morning would bring the same old routines, the same dented car, and the same $44,500 salary. But beneath the surface, the code was already running, the patterns were already shifting, and the Vance empire was already beginning to bleed. Love was dead, burned away by the fires of the Plaza Hotel and the revelations in the mahogany box. But in its place, something much more durable had been born. A resolve that was as cold and hard as the silver USB drive resting on my nightstand. I was Riley Vance, and I was no longer following instructions. I was writing the new ones, and they were designed to ensure that when the dust finally settled, the name Vance would only be associated with the woman who had built the company and the granddaughter who had been smart enough to take it back. Everything my father had done to keep me small had only served to make me more focused, more invisible, and more lethal. and as the sun began to rise over the East River, I knew that the countdown to his downfall had officially reached 0. The next morning, the city was draped in a suffocating, low-hanging fog that blurred the edges of the skyscrapers. But my mind had never been sharper as I steered my dented 2012 Honda Civic toward the heart of the financial district. I was on my way to meet Arthur Sterling, a man whose reputation as a shark of a probate attorney was whispered in the corridors of power with a mixture of reverence and genuine terror. His office was located on the 50th floor of a glass and steel monolith that seemed to pierce the very clouds, and as I stepped out of the elevator, the atmosphere changed instantly from the humid grime of the New York streets to a sanctuary of power that smelled of expensive, freshly pulled espresso and the distinct dry scent of old money and leather-bound law. Arthur Sterling was a man who didn't just practice law, he wielded it like a scalpel, and as he sat behind a massive desk carved from a single slab of dark English oak, he looked at me with the piercing, analytical gaze of a predator who had just spotted a weakness in the herd. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or the rehearsed apologies my father had spent 27 years drilling into my head. Instead, I reached into my bag and handed him the documents from the mahogany box, along with the silver USB drive that held the digital skeleton of my father's crimes. "My God," he whispered, the sound barely audible over the soft hum of the building's climate control system as he adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and began to flip through the notarized pages with fingers that moved with practiced surgical precision. He paused on a specific document, his eyes narrowing as he read and reread the fine print that I had already memorized in the dark of a 7-Eleven parking lot just hours prior. "This is a 2021 codicil, Riley," he said, his voice dropping an octave into a register of grim realization that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Your grandmother was far sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She clearly saw your father's 2019 attempt to strip her of her primary voting rights while she was recovering from her stroke, and she penned this amendment in total secrecy to ensure that the power remained with the heir of her choosing, not the one who tried to usurp her." We spent the next 48 hours straight buried in that office, the passage of time marked only by the shifting light against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the mounting stacks of empty espresso cups that littered the side tables. We pulled every bank statement, every hidden corporate filing, and every obscured ledger from the Vance Global Logistics internal servers that I had been quietly mapping from my windowless supply closet for months. The data did not lie, and as a data architect, I watched the numbers align into a devastating narrative of greed and incompetence that my father and Madison thought was buried under layers of complex shell companies and offshore transfers. Harrison Vance had not just been a cold father, he had been a systematic thief, embezzling staggering sums from the company's development fund, a reserve meant for infrastructure and long-term growth, to cover the catastrophic losses of Madison's failed cryptocurrency investments. The total amount of the theft was exactly $6,400,000, a sum that had been bled out of the company in increments designed to avoid the notice of traditional auditors, but which stood out to my pattern recognition-focused brain like a flare in a midnight sky. While I was being called a genetic malfunction and paid a pittance to scan invoices, my father was funneling millions into a digital black hole to protect the reputation of his golden child, sacrificing the very foundation of my grandmother's legacy to maintain the illusion of Madison's brilliance. Arthur Sterling leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair, the light of 3 different monitors reflecting off his glasses as he looked at the final spreadsheet I had generated, a document that linked my father's private signatures to the unauthorized wire transfers with undeniable mathematical certainty. He told me that this wasn't just a civil matter of inheritance anymore. This was a criminal conspiracy that could dismantle the board of directors and send my father to a federal penitentiary if handled with the right level of aggression. I sat there, the fatigue of the last 2 days settling into my bones, but my resolve remaining as cold and hard as the marble floors beneath my feet, realizing that the man who had tried to make me a burden on the state was the one who had become a liability to the law. The office was quiet, the distant sound of the city's traffic filtered out by the triple-paned glass, and I felt a strange sense of detachment as I looked at the names Harrison and Madison Vance on the screen, seeing them not as my family, but as data points that needed to be corrected. Arthur explained that the 2021 codicil gave me the legal standing to challenge my father's position as executor, and more importantly, it gave me a seat on the board that he had illegally withheld from me since my grandmother's death. We were no longer just looking for a way to get my fair share. We were preparing for a total decapitation of the current leadership, a hostile takeover that would use the very truth my father thought I was too dim-witted to understand. Every hour we spent in that room, cross-referencing tax returns with the encrypted files on the USB drive, felt like I was reclaiming a piece of my soul that had been chipped away by years of being told I wasn't enough. I thought about the $4.2 million mansion in Greenwich and the $90 million empire, and I realized that none of it was built on the merit my father preached so loudly about at the Plaza Hotel. It was built on the silence of a woman who couldn't defend herself and the exploitation of a daughter he thought would never look at the books. But he had forgotten that my dyslexia made me see the world in systems, not just sentences. The $6.4 million embezzlement was the crack in the dam, and as Arthur began drafting the initial injunctions and the notice of a special board meeting, I knew that the flood was coming for the man who had tried to drown me in obscurity. We didn't leave the office until the sun began to rise on the third day, the sky over the East River turning a bruised purple and orange, a beautiful and violent start to the day that would mark the beginning of the end for the Vance dynasty as the world knew it. Arthur looked at me before I walked out, his expression one of genuine respect, a look I had never once received from Harrison Vance in 27 years of trying to earn it. You realize, Riley, that once we file these papers, there is no going back to being their daughter or their sister, he said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep and too much caffeine. I looked him dead in the eye, my hand gripping the strap of my bag which contained the digital evidence of my father's ruin, and I told him that I had stopped being their daughter the moment they laughed at me at table 42. I wasn't looking for a family anymore. I was looking for justice, and I was going to get it by being the person they were too arrogant to see standing right in front of them. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like a descent from the heavens back to the battlefield, and as I walked out into the crisp morning air of Manhattan, I felt a lightness in my step that had nothing to do with the lack of sleep. The $6.4 million wasn't just a number on a page. It was the price of my father's soul and the cost of Madison's unearned arrogance, a debt that was finally coming due with interest that they couldn't possibly afford to pay. I got back into my Honda, the engine turning over with a defiant roar, and I headed back toward Queens to change my clothes and prepare for the board meeting that Arthur had scheduled for the following Monday. I would walk into that boardroom not as a junior clerk or a genetic malfunction, but as the primary shareholder and the only person in the room who actually knew how to save the company from the wreckage my father had created. The contrast between my $60 Zara dress and the high-stakes environment I was about to enter didn't bother me anymore because I knew that the data was on my side. And in the world of logistics and finance, data is the only language that truly matters. My father had spent decades trying to ensure I followed instructions, but he never realized that I was the one who was going to write the final chapter of his legacy. A chapter that would expose his fraud and his cruelty to the very elite he so desperately craved the approval of. As I drove across the bridge, the sunlight reflecting off the water in a blinding, beautiful shimmer, I felt a sense of peace that only comes from knowing you are exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly what you were born to do. I was Riley Vance, the girl who couldn't read, but who could see the truth hidden in millions of lines of code, and the hostile takeover was no longer a dream or a plan. It was an inevitability, a mathematical certainty that would restore the Vance name to the woman who had actually earned it, while leaving the men and women who hijacked it with nothing but the echoes of their own hollow laughter. Family isn't about blood or names on a will. It's about the integrity of the bond and the courage to see one another for who they truly are, a lesson my father would soon learn at a cost he never anticipated. I was no longer the girl tucked behind the pillar at the plaza. I was the architect of a new empire, and as the city woke up around me, I knew that the storm I had carried in my passenger seat was finally ready to break. The 48 hours of grueling work with Arthur Sterling had forged a weapon out of my grandmother's secrets and my own analytical mind, and I was ready to use it to dismantle the wall of lies that had been my life's boundary for far too long. The countdown had ended, the data was compiled, and the era of Harrison Vance's deception was about to be closed out with a final, unyielding audit that he wouldn't be able to survive. I triggered an emergency board meeting for May 18th at exactly 10 a.m., a move that sent a silent but undeniable shockwave through the upper echelons of Vance Global Logistics, though the man at the top was still far too arrogant to feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. When I arrived at the corporate headquarters in the financial district, I didn't take the service entrance or the freight elevator I had used for months as a junior clerk. Instead, I walked through the main lobby, my heels clicking with a heavy, deliberate rhythm on the polished granite floors that felt like a countdown to the end of an era. I rode the high-speed glass elevator to the 42nd floor, the ascent so smooth it felt like floating, and as the doors slid open, I was met with the familiar scent of ozone, expensive upholstery, and the sterile coldness of a world that had tried to exclude me since birth. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the boardroom, a space dominated by a 20-foot-long mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Brooklyn Bridge and the churning gray waters of the East River. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with a misplaced sense of security, as my father, Harrison Vance, was leaning back in his executive chair, laughing heartily with the directors as if this meeting were merely a formality or a tedious interruption of his lunch plans. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from jovial amusement to a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt that crinkled the edges of his eyes and tightened the set of his jaw. "Riley, did you get lost looking for the coffee machine?" he asked, his voice echoing off the acoustic panels with a sharp, mocking edge that caused a few of the older directors to chuckle into their hands. I didn't flinch, and I didn't look away, even as I felt the weight of their collective dismissal pressing against me like a physical wall. Standing beside him was Madison, looking every bit the heir apparent in a tailored navy silk dress, her expression one of bored irritation as she checked her $15,000 gold Cartier tank watch with a dramatic flick of her wrist. "Security! Escort the clerk out immediately," she ordered, her voice carrying that practiced, high society rasp that signaled she was used to being obeyed without question. She didn't even look at me when she said it, treating me like a piece of misplaced furniture or a smudge on the glass that needed to be wiped away before the real business could begin. But I did not move, and I certainly did not obey. Instead, I walked to the very head of the table, the place where my grandmother Evelyn used to sit, and I placed a heavy, black, pebbled leather portfolio onto the mahogany surface with a thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. The sound was a punctuation mark on my old life, and as the two security guards hesitated at the door, confused by my sudden, quiet authority, I pulled out a heavy ergonomic chair and sat down in the seat reserved exclusively for the majority shareholder of Vance Global Logistics. The room went deathly silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster, as the directors exchanged bewildered glances, and my father's face began to flush a deep, dangerous purple. For 27 years, I had been the girl who couldn't read the room, the genetic malfunction who had to be hidden away. But as I sat there, looking at the man who had stolen $6.4 million from his own mother's legacy, I realized that I was the only one who truly understood the architecture of the moment. Harrison leaned forward, his hands slamming onto the table with a force that rattled the crystal water carafes, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he demanded to know what kind of pathetic stunt I thought I was pulling. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get out of that chair before I have you arrested for trespassing, Riley," he spat, the veins in his neck standing out like cords of wood. I didn't answer him with words at first. Instead, I opened the portfolio and slid a series of notarized documents across the table toward the board's lead counsel, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had served the company for 30 years. I watched his eyes scan the 2021 codicil, the legal amendment my grandmother had hidden in the mahogany box, and I saw the moment his professional composure fractured into sheer disbelief. He looked from the paper to me, then to my father, his face paling as he realized that the legal foundation of Harrison's presidency had just been vaporized by a girl they all thought was a clerk. The documents were supplemented by the data I had painstakingly compiled during those 48 hours with Arthur Sterling, a digital map of the embezzlement and the fraudulent transfers that Madison had used to drown her failed crypto ventures. Madison's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of mounting panic as she saw the sheer volume of evidence resting on the table, her hand instinctively covering her Cartier watch as if to protect the spoils of her unearned life. She tried to speak, her voice cracking as she called the documents forgeries, but her protest died in her throat when I opened my laptop and projected a live feed of the company's internal ledger onto the massive 60-inch screen at the front of the room. I had bypassed their security protocols weeks ago, and now the $6,400,000 hole in the development fund was displayed in glowing red numbers for every director to see. I wasn't the girl who couldn't read. I was the architect who had built a mirror that forced them to see the truth of their own corruption. My father stood up, his chair skidding back against the hardwood floor with a harsh, screeching sound, and for a moment, I thought he might actually leap across the table, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and the sudden, terrifying realization that he was trapped. "This is my company," he roared, his voice cracking with the strain of a man losing his grip on a world he thought he had mastered through fear and deception. But Marcus Thorne, the man who had been his loyal soldier for decades, slowly shook his head as he held up the 2021 codicil, his voice trembling slightly as he informed the board that according to the late Evelyn Vance's final directives, Harrison had been stripped of his voting rights the moment he touched the development fund for personal use. The majority share, the voting control, and the right to appoint the CEO now resided solely with me, the daughter he had spent a lifetime trying to erase. I looked at my father, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to seek his approval or apologize for my existence. I felt a profound, cold sense of justice that was more satisfying than any praise he could have ever offered. He was no longer the giant who had towered over my childhood. He was just a small, desperate man who had built an empire on a foundation of lies, and I was the one who had finally pulled the thread that would unravel it all. I didn't need to yell, and I didn't need to cry. I simply sat in the seat of power and watched as the security guards, who had been ordered to remove me, instead turned their attention to my father and sister, waiting for my command. The contrast was no longer sickening. It was complete, a total inversion of the hierarchy that had defined the Vance name for a generation. Madison was sobbing now, a sharp, ugly sound that filled the boardroom, her Ivy League degrees and her Porsche Taycan suddenly feeling like the fragile glass baubles they truly were when faced with the weight of criminal evidence. She looked at me, begging me to stop, to think about the family, but the word family felt like a foreign language that I had finally learned to translate into something much more honest. Family isn't a license to steal, and it isn't a weapon to be used against the vulnerable. It is a bond of trust that they had broken every single day for 27 years. I turned my gaze back to the board of directors, men and women who had watched my father demean me for years and had done nothing, and I told them in a voice that was clear, steady, and undeniably powerful that the meeting was officially in session. The 42nd floor boardroom was no longer a palace of arrogance. It was a courtroom where the verdict had already been reached by the data and the truth my grandmother had left behind. Every line of code I had written, every invoice I had scanned in that windowless closet, and every insult I had endured at the dinner table had led to this precise moment of total, unyielding clarity. I was Riley Vance, and I was no longer a junior clerk, a genetic malfunction, or a burden on the state. I was the majority shareholder and the new CEO of Vance Global Logistics. As I looked out the window at the city I had learned to navigate in the dark, I knew that the storm had finally arrived. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the thunder because I was the one who had written the instructions for the rain. The weight of the mahogany table under my hands felt solid and real, a tangible connection to the legacy that my grandmother had actually intended for me, a legacy built on the ability to see what others missed. My father was led out of the room in a silence that was far more damaging than his laughter had ever been. His shoulders slumped and his legacy in tatters, followed closely by a sister who had never learned that power without integrity is just a temporary loan. I sat at the head of the table, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes, and I began the work of rebuilding a $90 million company from the wreckage of a lie. This was the moment of my greatest triumph, not because I had won a title or a fortune, but because I had finally proven that the girl who couldn't read was the only one in the room who knew how to tell the truth. The meeting lasted for hours, a grueling process of legal maneuvers and immediate terminations. But I felt more energized with every passing minute, my brain processing the complex logistical challenges of the takeover with an ease that felt like breathing. I was finally in the light, no longer hidden behind marble pillars or tucked away in supply closets, and as the sun reached its zenith over the financial district, I realized that the point of no return was the best place I had ever been. The world would soon know that Vance Global Logistics was under new management, and for the first time in its history, the person at the helm wouldn't be apologizing for who they were, but rather leading with the strength of who they had always been meant to be. I was the architect of my own destiny, and as I signed the first executive order of my tenure, I knew that the story of the Vance family was finally being written by the only person who actually knew how to read the patterns of the heart. As of 9 a.m. today, I represent 51% of the voting shares of Vance Global Logistics, I said, my voice sounding like dry ice, cold, sharp, and capable of burning anything it touched. I stood at the head of the 20-foot mahogany table and began to methodically slide heavy, cream-colored cardstock copies of the updated 2021 codicil toward each of the 12 directors. The sound of the paper whispering against the wood, the only noise in a room that had gone suddenly, violently, dead silent. The chairman of the board, Arthur Sterling's old associate, and a man named Silas Vane, who had been a titan in the industry since before my father could spell the word logistics, picked up his copy with trembling fingers, his eyes widening as he realized the legal trap my grandmother had set and that I had finally sprung. And per Article 4 of the bylaws, which specifically dictates the protocol for fiscal transparency in the event of a majority ownership shift, I am calling for an immediate forensic audit into the $6,400,000 that went missing from the 2023 Q3 earnings reports, I continued, my gaze fixed directly on the man who had called me a genetic malfunction less than a week ago. My father's face, usually a mask of aristocratic composure and expensive skin treatments, turned the deep, mottled color of a bruised plum, the transformation so rapid it looked painful as the blood rushed to his head in a mixture of blind rage and dawning, paralyzing fear. Across from him, Madison's hands began to shake with such violent intensity that her $500 limited edition Montblanc Meisterstuck pen slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor, the sound of the precious resin hitting the hardwood echoing like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. She didn't even reach down to retrieve it, her eyes locked on the glowing red numbers still projected on the 60-inch screen behind me. Numbers that represented the digital trail of her failed ambition and our father's criminal desperation. I reached out and tapped a single key on my 2024 Midnight Black MacBook Pro, activating the secondary partition on the silver USB drive that my grandmother had hidden away like a ticking time bomb for this exact moment of reckoning. The boardroom's high-fidelity hidden speakers crackled to life, and suddenly the room was filled with the unmistakable, gravelly resonance of my father's voice, recorded 5 years ago during a private meeting he thought was unmonitored. On the tape, He was speaking to a silent confidant, his tone dripping with a level of arrogance that made his current public persona look like a humble facade, as he explicitly referred to the current board of directors as nothing more than senile fossils who were standing in the way of his absolute control. "I'll keep them happy with their dividends for now," his recorded voice sneered, "but eventually, I'm going to dispose of the lot of them and replace them with people who know how to follow my lead without asking questions about the offshore overhead." The chairman, Silas Vane, who had been a silent witness to my father's rise and who had endured years of subtle disrespect and ageist dismissals, looked up from the document, his weathered face hardening into a mask of cold, professional finality. He didn't look at Harrison, who was now gasping for air like a fish out of water, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. Instead, Silas looked directly at me, acknowledging for the first time in 27 years that the daughter in the windowless closet was the only Vance in the building with a shred of integrity. "The floor is yours, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a gavel strike, and with those 5 words, the reign of Harrison Vance was effectively erased from the history of the company he had tried to steal. I felt the shift in the room's energy immediately, the directors who had previously laughed at my father's jokes now leaning toward me with an intense, desperate focus, realizing that their own survival was now tethered to the girl they had once ignored. I didn't waste a second on the emotional satisfaction of their downfall, because as a data architect, I knew that the execution of a strategy is just as vital as the design, and I had a $90 million empire to stabilize before the markets opened and the news of the scandal broke. I began to lay out the restructuring plan I had developed during the 48-hour marathon in Arthur Sterling's office, detailing the exact mechanisms we would use to recover the $6.4 million from my father's personal assets and the Hamptons estate that was now legally forfeit under the new audit protocols. Every word I spoke was backed by a technical precision that left no room for argument, as I explained how my pattern recognition-focused brain had identified the bypasses Harrison had used to funnel money through the New Jersey warehouse leases. I watched my father sink lower into his chair, the midnight blue Brioni suit that usually signified his power now appearing several sizes too large for him, as if the exposure of his lies had physically shrunken his stature. Madison was no longer smirking or checking her Cartier watch. She was staring at the table, her breathing shallow and ragged, realizing that the golden future she had been promised was nothing more than a mirage built on a foundation of embezzled funds and broken trust. The contrast between the room's current atmosphere and the gala at the Plaza Hotel was total, a cold and clinical environment where the only currency that mattered was the truth contained in the lines of code and the notarized signatures. I guided the board through the immediate steps of the hostile takeover, including the filing of a formal criminal complaint with the SEC and the appointment of a new interim executive team that did not include a single person who had participated in the cover-up. Silas Vane nodded along with every point, his respect for my tactical brilliance growing with every slide I displayed, while the rest of the board remained in a state of stunned compliance, too terrified of their own potential liability to do anything but follow the instructions of the new majority shareholder. I realized then that my father's greatest mistake wasn't just the theft or the cruelty. It was the assumption that my dyslexia made me weak, when in reality, it had forced me to develop a level of intellectual resilience and technical mastery that he couldn't even comprehend. As I reached the conclusion of my presentation, I looked at the man who had spent my entire life apologizing for my existence, and I didn't see a villain or a titan. I saw a small-minded man who was finally being held accountable by the very person he thought was a burden on the state. Harrison tried one last time to regain control, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine as he started to say my name, but I cut him off with a single, sharp gesture that silenced him more effectively than any shout ever could. "You are no longer an officer of this company, Harrison, and as of this moment, your access to the Greenwich House and all corporate accounts has been revoked," I stated, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. I have already dispatched a team to secure the physical assets, and your personal effects will be delivered to a hotel of your choosing by the end of the business day, provided you can find one that accepts a frozen credit card." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of power that I filled with my own quiet, unyielding presence as I stood at the head of the table, the undisputed architect of the new Vance Global Logistics. The $90 million empire was no longer a hijacked vessel steered by a thief. It was a calibrated machine under the control of the person who actually understood how every gear and lever worked. I looked around the room, from the chairman to the trembling Madison, and I realized that the journey from the windowless supply closet to this seat had been the most rigorous training program in the world. I wasn't just Riley Vance, the girl who couldn't read. I was the leader who had survived the fire, and as I gathered my leather portfolio and prepared to lead the first legitimate audit in 20 years, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any ocean. Family is the first world we ever know, and when that world is built on lies and conditional love, the only way to survive is to build a new one based on the data of your own worth. My father had spent 27 years trying to ensure I followed his instructions, but he had failed to realize that the person who follows instructions is often the one who learns exactly how to rewrite them. As the security team finally entered the room to escort my father and sister toward the elevators, I didn't look back to watch their exit because my eyes were already on the monitors, watching the first streams of clean data begin to flow through the system. The 2024 midnight black Chevrolet Tahoe I had ordered was waiting downstairs to take me to the first of many press conferences, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about the words I would say. I was the architect of the truth, and in the new era of Vance Global, the only thing that would ever be allowed to stand was the facts, presented with the clarity and precision that only someone who had fought for every letter could ever truly provide. The meeting was adjourned at 11:45 a.m., and as the directors filed out, many of them stopping to offer me a handshake that I accepted with a polite, distant nodding, I realized that the point of no return was actually a beginning. I stayed in the boardroom for a few minutes after everyone had left, the hum of the city through the windows sounding like a victory march as I looked at the empty chair where my father had sat for so long. I thought about my grandmother Evelyn and the mahogany box, and I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had seen the gift in my struggle before I was even old enough to see it myself. I was Riley Vance, and the story of the girl who couldn't read had officially ended, replaced by the reality of the woman who had rewritten the entire world to fit her vision. I walked out of that boardroom and toward the executive elevator, my head held high and my heart full of the cold, clean light of justice, ready to start the first day of the rest of my life as the person I was always meant to be. By 5 o'clock that evening, the world that Harrison Vance had spent 3 decades constructing out of arrogance and embezzled funds had effectively collapsed, leaving him standing on the sidewalk of the financial district without a badge, a title, or a shred of the dignity he had used as a weapon against me for 27 years. The transition of power was clinical, swift, and absolute, executed with the kind of logistical precision that he always claimed I was too intellectually inferior to master. By the time the markets closed, he was officially removed as chief executive officer, a decision ratified by a board of directors who were now more terrified of my forensic data than they were of his fading influence. Madison, the golden child whose Ivy League degrees had been bought with the stolen potential of the development fund, was stripped of her title as COO and given a cold 24-hour deadline to return the keys to the 2024 frozen blue metallic Porsche Taycan and vacate her executive suite. I watched from the glass walls of the conference room as she was escorted to the elevators, her face a mask of tear-streaked ruin, clutching a cardboard box of personal belongings that looked pathetic against the backdrop of the $90 million empire she thought she would rule by birthright. I moved into the corner office on the 42nd floor, not because I had a sudden desire for the panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline or the prestige associated with the mahogany desk, but because I had finally earned the seat through a level of labor and strategic brilliance that none of them could comprehend. The office still smelled faintly of my father's expensive tobacco and the sterile scent of success he had cultivated. But as I sat in the high-backed leather chair, I felt the space begin to transform under the weight of my own presence. I replaced the framed accolades and the vanity photos of my father with his powerful friends with my own hardware, setting up my custom-built monitors and the mechanical keyboard that had been my only companion in the windowless supply closet. The silence in the room was no longer the heavy, judgmental quiet of a daughter waiting for a father's approval, but the profound, expansive peace of an architect who had finally seen her blueprint become a reality. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the floor-to-ceiling windows, my inbox began to chime with a frantic, rhythmic persistence that I recognized immediately as the sound of a predator becoming the prey. My parents, Harrison and Eleanor, sent 14 frantic emails in less than 3 hours, their tone shifting from commanding and indignant to weeping and desperate as they realized the extent of their financial decapitation. They were begging for a family meeting at the Greenwich Mansion, calling for a sit-down to resolve what they termed a temporary misunderstanding, their words a tangled mess of gaslighting and faux affection that I could read with perfect clarity despite my dyslexia. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt, nor did I feel the need to justify my actions. Instead, I felt a cold, liberating detachment as I drafted a single, final response. I replied to the entire chain, including a CC to Arthur Sterling and the rest of my high-stakes legal team, stating simply that I was unfortunately not academic enough to understand the complexity of their requests and that they should direct all future correspondence to my attorneys. Using their own cruel words against them was not an act of revenge, but an act of closure, a final boundary drawn in the sand of our shared history that ensured they would never again have the power to make me feel small. I left the office that night and drove my dented 2012 Honda Civic home one last time, the car feeling like a relic of a life that I had outgrown through sheer force of will and mathematical certainty. A few weeks later, I moved into my new home, a quiet, sun-drenched architectural masterpiece in the hills of Connecticut that I had purchased with my own independent earnings, a place where the air was clean and the walls were not haunted by the echoes of Harrison Vance's disappointment. I now sit in my expansive, minimalist living room, the late afternoon light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, looking at a physical check that had just arrived via a private courier for my first quarterly dividend as the majority shareholder of Vance Global Logistics. The amount on the check was $47,200,000, a figure that represented not just wealth, but the total restoration of my grandmother Evelyn's legacy and the final, undeniable proof that the girl who couldn't read was the most valuable asset the company had ever possessed. It was a sum that made the modest trust my father had mocked at the plaza look like pocket change, and yet the money was the least significant part of my new reality. The true inheritance was the silence, the lack of fear, and the knowledge that I no longer had to translate my existence for people who were committed to misunderstanding me. My pattern recognition had led me out of the labyrinth they had built, and as I placed the check on the marble coffee table, I realized that I was no longer a genetic malfunction or a follower of instructions. I was the person who set the standard, the one who saw the logic in the chaos, and the one who had finally discovered that self-worth is something you build with your own hands, brick by digital brick. Cutting off my toxic family was not a tragedy, though the world often tries to paint it as such. It was a surgical necessity, a removal of a diseased limb that allowed the rest of my life to finally begin to heal and thrive. I thought about my mother's silent complicity and my sister's unearned arrogance, and I felt a sense of pity that was entirely devoid of warmth. They were still trapped in the world of appearances and stolen prestige, while I was living in a world of truth and technical mastery, a world where the data always reached its logical conclusion. The $47,200,000 was a tool I would use to modernize the company, to fund literacy programs for children who processed the world like I did, and to ensure that the name Vance would eventually be synonymous with innovation rather than embezzlement and cruelty. I realized then that family is not defined by the blood that flows through your veins, but by the integrity of the people who stand by you when the lights go out. And for the first time in my 32 years, I was surrounded by a silence that felt like a sanctuary. I watched the shadows stretch across the lawn, the 2024 black Chevrolet Tahoe High Country parked in the driveway, a symbol of a life that was now entirely of my own making. My father and Madison were likely huddled in a lawyer's office somewhere, trying to find a loophole in a trap that had been set by the woman who raised them and sprung by the daughter they ignored. But their struggles were no longer my concern. I reached for a glass of water, my fingers steady and my heart calm, and I thought about the girl who used to cry in the bathroom because the letters on the page wouldn't stop moving. I wanted to go back and tell her that one day she wouldn't just read the page, she would own it, and the very people who called her a burden would be the ones begging for her mercy. I realized that the greatest power in the world is not money or titles, but the ability to define yourself on your own terms, regardless of the narrative others try to force upon you. The dividends of my life were now being paid in peace, in clarity, and in the freedom to exist without apology, a wealth that no bank could ever fully contain. I had spent 27 years waiting for a seat at their table, only to realize that I was meant to build a better one. And as the stars began to appear over the Connecticut woods, I felt a deep, resonant connection to the woman my grandmother had known I would become. The story of Riley Vance was no longer a cautionary tale of a daughter who couldn't keep up. It was a blueprint for a woman who had overtaken the world in the dark. I am 32 years old. I am a data architect. I am the CEO of a $90 million empire, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I closed my eyes and breathed in the quiet air of my own home, I knew that I had finally found the only family that ever truly mattered, the one I found within myself.